On the morning of August 12, 1970, a young man named Lawrence Hallahan drove along a coastal road in County Cork, Ireland. Out the car window to his right, he could see an area called Towhead Bay, which was a shoreline with a lot of really cool rock formations that also led out to the Atlantic Ocean. People came from all over Ireland to see Towhead Bay. But for Lawrence, the incredible view was just part of his daily commute, so he really wasn't paying much attention to it. However, as he's driving along, out of the corner of his eye, he sees something unusual floating in the water out in Towhead Bay. And he looks and he sees it was a sailboat, which was really odd, not because, boats don't go in the water, they do, but in Towhead Bay, people just didn't sail out there because it was just not safe. There was lots of rocks. This is not a place where you sail a boat. But then Lawrence, as he's driving along, sort of glancing out at the sailboat, he remembered this story that had been all over the news recently. It was about the 66-year-old retired naval officer named Edward Neal who had gone missing at sea. A few months ago, Edward had set off in his personal sailboat, which was called the Unsolved, on a journey from England to the Isle of Man. Now, the route was a very simple, straight shot that should have only taken about 36 hours to complete, but Edward had never arrived at his destination. His family had ultimately reported him missing, and the Coast Guard had been searching for his boat ever since. But so far, they hadn't found it anywhere. And so his disappearance had become this huge mystery, because it really just didn't make any sense. Number one, there hadn't been any serious storms in the area where he was going to be, and so it was just unlikely that his boat was, damaged or he was blown off course or something. But then two, let's say something did happen. Let's say there was an emergency, his boat was damaged or he was blown off course or something else happened. He was an expert sailor, an expert mariner. He was ready to handle practically any emergency at sea. But then even more, had something happened and had he been overwhelmed and even he couldn't handle it, he never made any distress calls. Not once. There was no distress calls from him at all, period. But now, as Lawrence looked out at the boat floating in Towhead Bay, which was hundreds of miles away from Edward's planned route, he saw the name on the boat. It said Monaveen, painted right on the side. It was Edward's. And so Lawrence's heart began to race, like he couldn't believe that he had just found this. Like, how is nobody else seeing this? And so without really thinking much about it, Lawrence parked his car, hopped out, and literally just ran down to the shore to go investigate further, to get a better look at the Monaveen. And so Lawrence, he carefully made his way across a bunch of slippery rocks until he finally reached the edge of the water. And the Monaveen really wasn't that far out into the water. It was floating maybe 3 or 4 yards away. And so, without even taking his shoes or anything off, Lawrence just leapt into the water and started swimming out to the boat. It only took him a few seconds to reach the boat, and when he did, he pulled himself up onto the deck. And once he was up there, Lawrence looked around and didn't see any obvious damage. But there also didn't seem like there was any signs of recent activity. So he just began calling out over and over, like, is anybody here? Anybody on board? But there was no response. It seemed like Edward must have at some point abandoned his boat. So Lawrence just began exploring, figuring there must have been some kind of problem on board, which must have caused Edward to have left it behind. And at this point, he didn't really feel like he was invading the guy's privacy because this was a huge news story. People were looking for him. And so Lawrence is like, maybe I can solve this mystery once and for all. And so Lawrence found his way to the helm of the boat, which is where the steering wheel is. And there, right beside the steering wheel, Lawrence saw a special type of two-way marine radio. And he just reached over and he pressed the on button, and to his shock, the radio turned on. The radio worked. And at this point, Lawrence felt a combination of confusion, of curiosity, and of just general unease. If the radio worked, why hadn't Edward just called for help? Lawrence saw there was an enclosed area in the center of the deck, which he knew must be where the boat's kitchen, the bathroom, and the bedroom were. So now, feeling a little bit nervous, he walked over, he found the door, and he pushed it open. And sure enough, Lawrence found himself standing inside the boat's kitchen. And the kitchen was very clean and also very well stocked. There were at least like a dozen packages of biscuits, along with a bunch of fresh water. There was tea, cocoa, powdered milk. And seeing all this made Lawrence even more confused, because why would Edward abandon an undamaged boat, at least so far it's undamaged, with a working radio and a bunch of food and water on board? However, when Lawrence walked from the kitchen into the bedroom area and saw what was in there, he realized that Edward had not abandoned his boat. Because right there, in the bed, was Edward, and he was dead. But it would turn out, once they found Edward's body, the mystery around what happened to him only got more bizarre. Because even though Edward had been missing for 3 months, an autopsy determined that he'd only been dead for about 1 month. But when Lawrence found him, Edward was so emaciated that he practically looked like a skeleton. He weighed just 62 pounds, and he had died of starvation. And so to this day, nobody has ever been able to explain where Edward was during those 2 months when the Coast Guard was searching for him and he wasn't dead yet. He was still alive. And why didn't he use his radio to call for help? And also, how did he starve to death when he was just a few steps away from a well-stocked kitchen? BetterHelp is the paid partner of today's video. Are you so used to keeping everyone else comfortable that you barely notice how often you abandon yourself in the process? I think a lot of us have been there. You get so used to putting everyone else first that taking care of yourself almost starts to feel selfish. And after a while, putting other people first stops feeling like a choice. Until one day, you realize you can't remember the last time a decision genuinely felt like your own. And the strange thing about constantly managing other people's comfort is that slowly you lose touch with your own. And this is where therapy can help you understand where those patterns come from. And it can help you rebuild trust in your own voice, your own instincts, and the parts of yourself that get pushed aside just to keep everybody else comfortable. BetterHelp makes starting therapy easier. Take the quiz and get matched with a credentialed therapist quickly. BetterHelp has served over 6 million people globally. Click the link in the description or go to betterhelp.com/MrBallen and get 10% off your first month of therapy. On the morning of November 10th, 1982, a 54-year-old woman named Mary Kemp was sitting in her living room in Salisbury, Maryland, when her phone rang. She answered it, and she heard a voice that she instantly knew was her 35-year-old son, Don. And Mary smiled when he heard him. And she asked Don where he was and how he was doing. So for the past month, Don had been on this cross-country road trip. He was working on a book about the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, and to research it, he'd set out in his SUV to go visit a bunch of historical landmarks from the Civil War era. Now, since Don had set out on this trip, he had made a point to check in with his mother at least once a week to fill her in and let her know how it was going. And this morning, just from the tone of Don's voice, Mary could tell clearly it was still going great. And so, with the phone in hand, Mary walked over to the couch and she curled up and she listened as her son told her all about how he was now in Wyoming and he was planning to visit this Old West museum that was there in just a few days. Mary told him to keep it up and have a great time, and then before he hung up, he promised he would call her back in a few days. 6 days later, on the morning of November 16th, a highway patrolman was driving down a highway in Carbon County, Wyoming. Carbon County is located about 2,000 miles away from Mary's house in Maryland. This patrolman was basically out in the middle of nowhere, and through his windshield, all he could see were just open plains on either side, and everything was covered with a thick blanket of snow. But as the patrolman approached an exit ramp up ahead, he saw something that looked really out of place. There was an SUV just sitting on the exit ramp, just idling right in the middle of the road. Its doors were wide open, there were what appeared to be clothes scattered all over the road, sort of outside of this vehicle, and the car had a Maryland license plate. Now, clearly to the patrolman, something was wrong here. So he pulled over and he walked up to the SUV to make sure the driver was okay. But when he reached the vehicle and looked inside, because again, all the doors are open, there was nobody in there. But through the open doors, he noticed on the other side of the car, on the ground, were what appeared to be footprints, like a set of footprints. And so the patrolman walked around the car, being careful not to step on all the clothes that was out there. He goes to the other side and he sees clearly somebody climbed out of this vehicle on the passenger side, landed in the snow, and then he looked, and the footprints, they wandered not along the road, but they go off the road, just out into the wilderness. An hour later, A Carbon County Sheriff's deputy was trudging through the snow following those footprints. He, along with several other deputies that he was with, had been sent out here specifically to follow these tracks and see where they went, like see what happened to the driver of this SUV. Like, this is so strange. Why would this person have gotten out like that and just wandered off? What's going on? And so these deputies, they're walking along, looking down, following this trail, and overhead they can hear the sound of a plane, because a plane had also been dispatched to fly overhead to see if they could spot this driver somewhere out in the wilderness. Now, this area, the area where the driver sort of walked off into, was so flat and so empty, it really should have been quite easy to spot anybody who was, wandering around in the snow. But on the ground, the deputy, along with all the others, they couldn't see anybody ahead of them. The footprints just kept on going past fields and random farmhouses, and overhead, the pilot, he hadn't seen anyone yet either. And so for the deputies on the ground, after following these tracks for 6 miles, they started to wonder, are these ever gonna end? What in the world was this person doing? Where were they going? But at about the 6-mile mark away from the highway, so away from the vehicle, the lead deputy, along with the others, they looked up ahead and they saw these tracks went right up to this big red barn off in the distance. That appeared to be the destination. And so now, moving with a bit of a purpose, because they're sensing they're about to, get to the end of this mystery here to see what happened to this driver, where they went, they began walking much faster and they followed the tracks right up to this barn. And where the tracks went into the barn was through this now closed door. But there were only prints going into the barn, and unless they exited the barn on the other side or something, it looked like they went into the barn and shut the door, and they're still inside of there. That was the initial impression. But when the lead deputy opened up that closed door and stepped inside, there was no one in there. It was clear that whoever had walked from the abandoned SUV to this barn had somehow left, but without leaving any new footprints in the snow, which literally should have been impossible. And so the lead deputy, he left the barn and just looked down at the prints that had led them there as if he was gonna learn something new. But actually, as he looked at these prints, which nobody else had stepped in, they had been very careful as they moved to this barn not to sully up the original prints, he noticed that some of the prints looked a little bit misshapen, almost like they had been stepped in more than once. And he got down closer and he began to realize that virtually all the prints that they had followed here were sort of misshapen. And so he began backtracking and he saw it the whole way. All these prints are like double prints. And so the only conclusion the lead deputy could come to, considering the prints stop at the barn and there's nobody in the barn, is that this driver, after walking 6 miles in the snow for reasons unknown to this barn, they must have left the barn and walked backwards, in reverse, in their original tracks, just back the way they came. And so the lead deputy and the others basically began walking the same tracks that brought them to the barn, but now in reverse, looking for maybe there's some point where it branches off and we just missed it. Maybe there's 1 or 2 steps that go off in a different direction, because no one walks 6 miles in reverse. And also, if that really happened, where is this person? But no, they followed the tracks all the way back to the car, and there were these duplicate prints in every one of them. So this person literally walked backwards for 6 miles, but then they're back at the car and they're where did they go? There's no other prints. There's nothing. Where are they? How is this even possible? That evening, investigators ran the abandoned SUV's license plate and learned that it belonged to a 35-year-old man named Don Kemp. Now, they couldn't get in touch with Don himself, but they did manage to get his mother, Mary, on the phone. And Mary told police that it actually did make sense that her son would be in Wyoming because he was on this big cross-country road trip. But she also said that she has no idea why he would have abandoned his car like that. And she said he had no history of mental illness, he wasn't taking any medications that could potentially disorient him, and he was just generally a really responsible guy. This didn't make sense to her at all. So the sheriff's department just went back to, searching the wilderness around where the car was found, looking for Don Kemp, searching the wilderness area, searching near the barn, looking everywhere. But despite searching on foot, with planes and even on horseback, another really serious push to find him, they didn't find anything new. And then on the third day of this big search, a huge blizzard swept through the area and forced the search to stop. The investigators knew that if Don had still been alive and outside in the area, he almost certainly would have frozen to death during that blizzard. And if he'd left the area, then he probably had done so on purpose, and he didn't want to be found, which could explain why he'd apparently purposefully hidden his tracks when he'd left the barn. So at the time of the blizzard, a decision was made not just to postpone the search, but actually to officially call it off. And then after the search ended, for months following it, Don Kemp's name remained in the news. His case was totally fascinating. It was so mysterious. Nobody knew what happened to him. But eventually, his case went totally cold. That is until April of 1983, so 5 months after Don disappeared. A woman in New York City received a very bizarre phone call. So this woman's name was Judy Aiello, and she actually knew Don personally because they had worked together for 10 years until Don actually went on to leave to go write his book, which entailed him eventually going off and, going missing. And so Judy was well aware of the fact that Don was missing and that the police were still basically looking for him, maybe not actively, but there was definitely an ongoing search for him. And she knew that so far nobody really knew anything. It was just this big mystery. And so with that as context, one day that April, Judy came home from work and she saw that she had a message on her answering machine. So she clicked the play button. And to her shock, the voice she heard that came out of this answering machine was Don Kemp's. All he said was, "I'd like to speak to you again. Call me." And then he gave the phone number to reach him at. And that was it. That was the whole message. But again, Judy had worked with him for 10 years. She's well aware of the fact that he's missing. She knows this is him. And immediately she calls this phone number because pretty much like everybody else, the belief here was that Don was very likely dead. And now it's like, no, he's fine. He's just called me. He's good. I'm going to find out what happened to him. Everything's going to be fine. And so she calls back this number expecting to hear Don. But when somebody picks up, it is a man, but it's definitely not Don. And so Judy, she just said, "Hey, I'd like to speak to Don Kemp. Can you put me in touch with him? He gave me this number." And the man on the other end of the line, he was very nervous. And he really wasn't sure why she was calling. It was very uncomfortable for him. And at some point he was like, "Okay, I'll let you talk to Don." But then very quickly he was like, no, he's not here. And then Judy, she's like, "Well, it's really important that I talk to him. Can you please at least tell him that I returned his call and have him call me back?" And the man was like, "Oh, okay." And he took down her number and he's like, "Oh, I'll tell him." And then he hung up. And so Judy, she slowly lowered the receiver and put it back in the cradle. And her first thought was like, wow, that was really weird and also very disappointing. I really want to talk to Don. But then she was thinking, wait a minute, is this whole thing just a prank? Because after all, Don's disappearance has been all over the news and any random person could have heard about it and maybe, found out that she knew him. And it seemed like a really cruel thing to do, but it was possible. However, as she thought about that, she realized that no, this literally could not be a prank. And not just because she was completely certain that the voice on her answering machine had been Don's, but also because Judy's phone number was not listed in a phone book anywhere. Which meant whoever placed the call and left that voicemail had to have known Judy personally. There was no other way to get that number. And so at that point, Judy realized it was not good enough to wait and hope that Don called her back. She had to go talk to the police. The next day, almost 2,000 miles away from New York City, where Judy had reported the bizarre phone call to the police, a police captain in Casper, Wyoming, knocked on the door of a trailer. So this captain, whose name was Mark Benton, had found out that the phone call Judy had received that she reported to police had been traced to this address in Wyoming, to this trailer. And this address was actually only about a 2-hour drive from the location where Don Kemp's abandoned SUV was found 5 months earlier. Benton already knew that this trailer belonged to a man named Mark Dennis. So when the door opened and Benton saw a man standing there, he asked, "Are you Mark Dennis?" And the man nodded and said, "Yes." So at that point, Captain Benton explained that he was there to investigate a phone call that had been traced back to this address, and that this phone call was potentially connected to the disappearance of a man named Don Kemp. But Mark just sort of stared back at Benton with a look of total confusion on his face. And then he said he didn't know anything about a phone call to New York and that he had never even heard of a Dawn Kemp. Now, Benton was not totally buying this because the idea that this guy, lives 2 hours away from where Dawn went missing and it was all over the news, 5 months ago and still is on the news pretty regularly. The idea that you had never heard of this guy, it was just a little bit fishy. And so we asked Mark if he'd be willing to come take a polygraph. And to his surprise, Mark said, sure. A couple of days later, Benton was sitting in his office at the sheriff's department, and he called Mark to schedule his polygraph. But Mark didn't answer the phone, so Benton left him a voicemail. And then a little while later, Benton got a call back. But it was not from Mark. It was from his new attorney, who said Mark would no longer be speaking to the police any further about this topic. A few weeks later, and another 2,000 miles away, Dawn's mother, Mary Kemp, sat in her home in Maryland, clutching the phone to her ear as Captain Benton gave her an update on her son's case. So Mary knew about the phone call Judy had received, which actually had been followed by several more calls, all from the same number. Judy never actually answered these calls. They all went to voicemail. They all sounded like Dawn. The messaging was very similar. It's like, I want to talk to you, call me back. But she was never able to actually connect with Dawn. Judy wasn't. And so for Mary, she was convinced that the answer to her son's disappearance must have something to do with Mark Dennis, because he was the guy who owned the trailer where all these calls were coming from, and he's lawyered up instead of taking his polygraph. Like, it must have to do with him. What other solution could there be here? Like, he must be involved. He has to be. But now, as part of his update to Mary, Captain Benton was telling her that Mark Dennis had outright denied knowing her son. And because Mark was not officially a suspect, they didn't have any concrete evidence against him, and he wasn't talking because he had lawyered up, the police were not planning to investigate him any further. And Mary, when she heard this, was genuinely stunned. I mean, those calls from Mark's trailer were the only clue that anybody had found in months. And she just couldn't understand why the investigators weren't looking into this more seriously. From day one, she had felt like Dawn's disappearance was at the bottom of the sheriff department's priority list. They'd called off the search after only a few days, and now they'd barely looked into the only suspect they had, who again lawyered up as soon as he was asked to take a polygraph test. Like, what is that? And so Mary wasn't sure if, these investigators were just incompetent or what, but she knew that at this point, there was only one thing she could do. She was going to fly out to Wyoming, and she was going to investigate her son's disappearance herself. A few weeks later, a very agitated Mary Kemp barged into the Carbon County Sheriff's Office in Wyoming, which was the law enforcement agency that originally investigated Dawn's disappearance. She walked right up to the front desk, identified herself, and demanded to see all the files on her son's case. The clerk looked a little bit taken aback by the way Mary was acting, but she nodded and then got up and went into the back of the office, and about a minute later, she came back with a file folder. And so she hands it over to Mary. Mary grabs it. She walks over to a nearby chair. She sits down. She opens up this file folder, and she begins flipping through all the evidence that had been collected so far. And Mary very quickly realized that there was way more to this story than the investigators had told her. Because as she looked at photos of her son's car from where it had been found on the highway when it was abandoned, she realized that it didn't actually look like her son had just stopped at random, gotten out, and walked off like the police had said. No, his car looked like it had been struck. So the mirror on the passenger side of the car was broken, and a gasket had been ripped off the door. So the gasket is the rubber sealing around the rim of the door so that when it shuts, it seals. Well, part of it had been ripped off the door. And also the key, which was still in the ignition when the car was found, was completely bent in half. And so to Mary, based on these photos, it immediately seemed obvious, at least to her, that her son did not just pull over and walk off. He must have been forced off the side of the road. Maybe somebody struck his car and, maybe they drove off, but maybe the impact of the strike had disoriented her son and it caused him to wander off. Or maybe somebody intentionally ran him off the road and then forced him, grabbed him and dragged him out of the car and let him off somewhere. But then also Mary's thinking, well, if there was another person who got out of their vehicle, where are their prints? Because there was only one set of prints, my son's. Or was that my son's prints? Are those his prints? She didn't know. And so it was just totally confounding. But Mary realized even if there was somebody else that sort of caused her son to go missing, somebody who ran him off the road or who grabbed him and pulled him out or whatever, overlooking all the facts, which are like, where are their footprints and why isn't there another car that we found that ran into him? Forget all that. Mary realized if there were other people involved, it was going to be nearly impossible to figure out who they were. Because for reasons she just could not understand, the investigators had not fingerprinted her son's car when it was found, and they hadn't made casts of the footprints in the snow. So there was no way to prove if anyone besides Dawn had been in the car, or if Dawn was even the one who made those tracks in the snow. And so any forensic evidence that could have maybe helped solve this case was now long gone. So if Mary wanted to find her son, she basically had to start from scratch. Over the next few weeks, Mary Kemp stayed in Wyoming and conducted her own investigation. She tracked down Mark Dennis, the man from the trailer where those bizarre phone calls had originated, and she actually spoke to him on the phone. However, just like he had with the police, Mark denied knowing anything about Dawn or those phone calls, and when Mary accused him of lying, he just hung up. Mary visited all the places she could think of where Dawn might have gone to. She also spoke to workers at the museums and other locations where she knew her son had been planning to go as part of his research for his book. She hired a private investigator, she put up posters with a reward for information, and she even went to a psychic for help. But basically, nothing worked. She got nowhere until finally, she got one meaningful lead. Through her investigation, Mary learned that apparently in April of 1983, around the time Judy got those strange phone calls, 2 people had seen a man who matched Dawn's description in Casper, which was the same town where Mark Dennis's trailer was. One was a bartender at a local tavern who remembered serving Dawn, and the other was someone who remembered seeing him at a traveling exhibit about Abraham Lincoln. And remember, the whole reason Dawn was even out there to begin with was to research Abraham Lincoln, so Mary thought that sighting at least had to be credible. I mean, it would be a pretty crazy coincidence if Dawn just happened to have a perfect doppelganger in Casper, Wyoming, who also happened to love Abraham Lincoln. However, by the time Mary actually learned about these sightings, it had been at least a full month since the actual sightings occurred, and now it seemed like if Dawn really had been in Casper, he wasn't anymore. Mary didn't find any other trace of her son there, or any clues as to where he might have gone next. I mean, the whole situation was so weird that Mary literally couldn't form a coherent theory about what might have happened to her son. In fact, the more Mary thought about it, the less sense any of this made. And so basically, she just reached a total dead end and eventually gave up and went back home to Maryland. And for the next 2 years, Mary continued not to get any answers about her son. But then, on October 4th of 1985, so almost 3 years after Dawn disappeared, everything changed. That day, a group of hunters were hiking through the woods in Carbon County, Wyoming, when one of them looked up ahead and they saw what looked like a bunch of white rocks lying in the grass. And so these hunters, they moved up to get a better look at these rocks. And as they got closer, they realized they were definitely not rocks. They were bones. And in fact, as they got close enough, they saw it was not just a couple of bones. It was like a perfectly intact human skeleton just lying in the grass, still wearing clothes, but just bones inside the clothes. When sheriff's investigators arrived on the scene, they found a wallet that was inside the skeleton's pants pocket. And in that wallet, there was a driver's license with the name Dawn Kemp. An autopsy found that Dawn had died of exposure, and there was no sign of foul play. The sheriff department's official conclusion was that on the day he disappeared, Dawn must have suffered a mental breakdown and walked into the wilderness voluntarily, and then at some point he had died, likely in that blizzard that happened 3 days later. Now, this sounds like a neat and tidy explanation, but really it only raises more questions. Because Dawn's body was found only 4 miles away from where his car was abandoned. Investigators had searched that area for days, and even if Dawn had been trying to hide from the search teams for whatever reason, this area was so bare and so flat that there really was nowhere to hide. And so it's just hard to imagine that Dawn was basically right there the whole time and nobody saw him. But then even if Don really had somehow died in the blizzard 3 days after his car was found, and despite all this search effort, he was never located, let's pretend that actually happened. Well, who made those phone calls from Mark Dennis's trailer 5 months later to Judy? Like, who was that? And also, how had he been spotted by 2 different people walking around the same town where those calls came from? And if there really was no foul play involved, why was Don's car so weirdly damaged when it was found? Like, who did that? The Carbon County Sheriff's Department was never able to answer any of those questions. And so Mary Kemp, when she died in 2014, died still wondering what really happened to her son. On the night of December 11th, 1988, a 38-year-old woman named Françoise Gendron touched up her lipstick in the bathroom mirror of a nightclub in the city of Tours, France. Her best friend, Sylvie Riverigo, was washing her hands at the sink right next to her. Françoise and Sylvie were best friends. They had basically known each other forever, since they were just little kids. And these days, they went out together almost every single night. They were both divorced, and Françoise's 19-year-old son had recently moved out of the house, so she was making the most of her new freedom and staying out late all the time, often with Sylvie. Now, Françoise and Sylvie were not exactly the same in terms of, their attitude towards life. Françoise had always been much more sociable and had this huge circle of friends, and so really she was the one who often had to push her much more introverted friend Sylvie to come out with her, but she usually did. However, tonight, it was Françoise who turned to Sylvie and said that she actually wanted to go home now. She told Sylvie that the men they were there with at the club, Michel and Luc, were making her feel uncomfortable, and she wanted to leave. Now, it was clear to Françoise pretty much immediately that Sylvie was pretty disappointed. Despite being introverted, now that they were out, Sylvie wanted to stay out. And also, they regularly went out with Michel and Luc, and there was never any issues before, and so she said as much to Françoise, like, what do you mean? Like, what's the issue? But Françoise just said she was getting a weird vibe from both of them and just would feel better if she went home. And so a few minutes later, Françoise and Sylvie walked back to the table where Michel and Luc were still sitting, and there was a receipt on the table, and Michel was putting his wallet away, like he had just paid for it. And actually, Michel, he turned to the women and he said, hey, are you guys ready to leave and go to the next club? But Françoise, she just kind of smiled and grabbed her coat and said that actually she was going to leave now. She said she had to get home to her boyfriend, who was probably already at her apartment and waiting for her. The men were pretty surprised by this, and maybe even a little bit offended. And Michel actually asked Françoise, like, hey, are you sure everything's okay here? Like, is that really the reason you're leaving? And Françoise just said, yep, everything's fine. I just gotta go. But she could definitely tell that the men did not believe her. But Françoise didn't really care. At this point, she really just wanted to leave. And so she just turned and gave Sylvie a hug and then just said bye to the group who were just kind of sitting there somewhat stunned. This is happening so quickly. And then Françoise turned and she hustled right out of the club and flagged down a cab before any of them could follow her. The next morning, Françoise woke up in her own bed to the sound of her boyfriend, Yves Martin, bustling around her bedroom and getting dressed. She rolled over to look at her alarm clock and saw that it was 8 a.m. Françoise sat up, and Yves turned to her and said good morning, but she immediately noticed that his voice was cold. And she knew why. The night before, when she had come home, they had gotten into a big argument because, he had been waiting for her for quite a while, for hours, by the time she finally got there. That was the reason she had to leave, and it really had upset him. And in many ways, this was not like a one-off issue in their relationship. It was a recurring one. Françoise was always staying out super late with her friends, and often with her male friends, and Yves felt like she was basically prioritizing all of them over him. He worked during the day, so the evenings were really the only time that he and Françoise could reasonably get together, but Françoise never seemed to get home until super late, and at that point it was too late for Yves to come over, or vice versa, and so they just didn't get to see each other as much as they could be. And so now, Françoise knew she had to do something to try to smooth things over with her boyfriend. So she turned to Yves and said, hey, do you want to come over tonight after you get off work? And she promised she would actually be home when he got there so they could cook dinner together and just spend some time together. It would be just a night for them. And at that, Françoise saw Yves' shoulders immediately relax. And then he turned around and he smiled at her and said, you know what? I'd really, really like that. And so at this point, the mood in the room completely shifted. They were sort of back on good terms. And so as Yves finished getting dressed, he asked Françoise what else she had going on that day. And she told him that she had a handyman she knew named Christian Moreau who was coming by that morning to put up new wallpaper in the apartment. So she'd very likely be stuck at home for most of the day while he worked on it. The two chatted for a bit longer, and then once Yves was ready to leave, Françoise kissed him goodbye, and then after he left, Françoise pulled herself out of bed and put on a robe. And then she went into the kitchen, and she opened up a can of food for her cat, and then she made herself some coffee. She was a bit hungover from the night before, and she thought maybe a warm bath would make her feel better. So after she drank her coffee, she ran a bath, she got into the water, and she closed her eyes. At 11 a.m. the next morning, so December 13th, a janitor at the Trousseau Hospital in Tours, France, was carrying a trash bag out to the dumpster when he noticed something odd. There were two blue trash bags just sitting out on a strip of grass in the middle of the hospital's parking lot. Now, the trash bags they used at the hospital were gray, so the janitor knew these bags, these blue bags, had to have been left there by someone from outside of the hospital. So the janitor walked over to the bags and sort of inspected them from the outside, and they were sort of bulky, but he couldn't really tell what was inside of them. And then he just reached down and he opened one of them, and when he saw what was inside, he immediately stumbled back, turned, and ran inside, shouting for someone to call the police. About an hour later, so just before noon on December 13th, 1988, Chief Inspector Francois Barbier of the Tours Police Department walked across the parking lot of the Trousseau Hospital. He'd been sent out here to investigate human remains that had been found outside of the hospital, and he was the first officer to arrive on the scene, and so now a janitor was walking with him to show him the way to where the remains had been found. They walked over to a grassy strip in the middle of the parking lot, and they stopped next to a pair of blue trash bags. Inspector Barbier knelt down and he opened up one of the bags, and inside, he saw very clearly there were two severed arms and the lower part of two legs. He opened up the other blue bag and he found it contained a woman's torso, but there was no pelvis, no thighs, and no head. Barbier turned to the janitor, who he knew had found the remains, and he asked him, when did you find this? And the janitor said that he had been out doing his rounds, throwing his own trash away around 11 a.m., and that's when he had seen them. But they definitely had not been there when he had done his rounds at 9 a.m. that day. So clearly these had to have been dropped off sometime between 9 and 11. Barbier stood up and looked around, and he noticed there actually was a medical school right down the street. And for a second, he wondered if maybe this was all just a tasteless prank by some of the students who could have maybe stolen a cadaver from the hospital's morgue and dropped it here. But as he thought about it, he just couldn't imagine medical students desecrating a human body like that. I mean, even as a prank, it just seemed not possible. And so to him, it just seemed like the more obvious answer here, albeit a gruesome one, was that this woman contained in these two bags had been murdered, and whoever killed her chopped her body up and put them in these bags because it would be easier to dispose of her body that way. And so Barbier hoped that when the forensics team showed up, they'd be able to find fingerprints from the killer on the blue trash bags. Because at this point, they didn't have a head of this woman. The victim didn't have a head. And so it could be very challenging to identify who it was. And if you didn't know who the victim was, it would be even harder to narrow down who might have killed her. 4 days later, on the afternoon of December 17th, Barbier was reading over an autopsy report at his desk. After the initial discovery of those blue trash bags at the hospital, more body parts from what appeared to be the same body had been found dumped behind a clothing store in a commercial part of town. But the head was still missing. And with no clues as to who the victim was, the investigation really was just barely crawling along. The police had put out a press release about the body's discovery, but so far no one had come forward with information, and there had been no women who had been reported missing in the area recently. Also, no usable fingerprints had been found on the trash bags, and so at this point, they really just didn't have forensic evidence, and so they were not able to even begin to track down who the killer was or what happened to them. And now, as Barbier continued to read through this autopsy report, he saw that the medical examiner had run the victim's fingerprints through the database, but there was no match. And so again, there's just no leads in this case so far. However, as Barbier continued reading through this report, he saw that the autopsy did reveal that the victim had died recently, probably only 1 day before her remains were discovered. She appeared to have bled to death from 2 deep gashes on her wrists, and there were also traces of an anti-anxiety medicine that was in her blood, which suggested she might have been drugged before she was killed. And Barbier was sort of baffled by this. because the method of murder almost seemed gentle and controlled compared to the extreme violence that was done to the body post-mortem. Like, those two things were totally in contrast with each other. And so he wondered if this was all done this way out of necessity. And so maybe the killer was just too small or too weak, or maybe both, to kill the victim without sedating her first. And then also, along those same lines, maybe they couldn't move her body without chopping it up first. And so as Barbier is just sort of thinking through what could have happened here, the phone on his desk rang. He put down the report and he picked up the phone, and it was a woman who said that she had just seen a newspaper article about the dead body, and she thought it could be a woman named Françoise Gendron, who lived in an apartment complex called La Vallée Violette. And so Barbier immediately sat up, he grabbed his pen, and he wrote down the name and the address. But before he could ask who the caller was or why she thought the victim could be this woman Françoise, the caller hung up. BetterHelp is the paid partner of today's video. Are you so used to keeping everyone else comfortable that you barely notice how often you abandon yourself in the process? I think a lot of us have been there. You get so used to putting everyone else first that taking care of yourself almost starts to feel selfish. And after a while, putting other people first stops feeling like a choice. Until one day, you realize you can't remember the last time a decision genuinely felt like your own. And the strange thing about constantly managing other people's comfort is that slowly you lose touch with your own. And this is where therapy can help you understand where those patterns come from. And it can help you rebuild trust in your own voice, your own instincts, and the parts of yourself that get pushed aside just to keep everybody else comfortable. BetterHelp makes starting therapy easier. Take the quiz and get matched with a credentialed therapist quickly. BetterHelp has served over 6 million people globally. Click the link in the description or go to betterhelp.com/MrBallen and get 10% off your first month of therapy. Half an hour later, Barbier walked through the hallway on the first floor of the La Vallée Violette apartment complex, where his mystery caller had told him his victim lived. This was the first lead he had gotten since the body was found, so he was hopeful that something would come of it. Now, the woman who called didn't actually give the apartment number for Françoise, just that she lived in this complex. And so Barbier just literally walked down the hallway and knocked on an apartment door at random. And the man who answered, Barbier asked him if he knew a woman named Françoise Gendron and did she live here? And the man just nodded and said, yep, she lives here. And then he pointed to a door right down the same hallway. And then the man, unprompted, told Barbier that he hadn't seen anybody go in or out of that apartment for at least a few days, and he was starting to get worried about Françoise's cat. Barbier's heart began to race, because if Françoise really did live in that apartment and she really hadn't been around in days, well, it seemed very possible that she was his victim. So he thanked the man and said he would handle it, and then he walked down the hallway to the door and he knocked. And there was no answer. But he could hear a cat meowing inside. And so at this point, Barbier was feeling really confident about the anonymous tip. And so he just turned and hurried back out to his car, and he radioed for a forensics team to come to this apartment complex. And then a few minutes later, they arrived carrying a battering ram to break down the door. And so Barbier and the team, they go back down the hallway to Françoise's door. Barbier got out of the way, and then the officers smashed it down with this ram. And then once it was open, Barbier stepped inside the apartment. As soon as Barbier was in this apartment, he was standing in the living room, and he looked around and nothing seemed disturbed. However, when he left the living room and went into the kitchen, it was a different story. Now, the kitchen was not a total disaster, but there was a broken dish on the ground and some food items that must have been on the dish at some point that also were scattered across the floor. And so just at first glance, it appeared like maybe some sort of struggle happened in here. However, Barbier looked around the kitchen and he didn't find any blood anywhere, so it was just this broken plate. And then when Barbier checked the rest of the apartment, no drawers or closets looked like they'd been ransacked, so this didn't appear like an apartment that had been robbed at any point. However, one thing Barbier did notice was in the bedroom, there were a few unopened rolls of wallpaper on a stool, like as if somebody had been about to do some work in the bedroom, but then just didn't. Barbier told the forensics team to first make sure the cat got fed, because there was a cat in here, and the cat was, a little malnourished, but basically okay. and then to sweep the apartment for fingerprints to see whether Francoise's prints matched the victim. And if she was the victim, he was hoping they might also find fingerprints or blood inside the apartment from whoever might have killed her. And so the forensics team, they got to work, and Barbier, he just continued sort of walking around the apartment, looking at photos that were out on display to maybe get a sense of Francoise's body size, to sort of mentally compare it to the victim's body. And as he was doing this, he happened to glance out the window and he saw a young man standing on the sidewalk outside who clearly was watching the police through the glass. And when Barbier locked eyes with this guy, the guy suddenly looked terrified and he just turned and began speed walking away, at which point Barbier opened up the window and shouted at this guy to stay right where he was. An hour later, Inspector Barbier walked into an interview room at the Tours police station and sat down across from the young man who had been watching Francoise's apartment. By now, he knew this man's name was Yves Martin, and he claimed to have been Francoise's boyfriend. And so Barbier sits down and he asks Yves, what were you doing outside of Francoise's apartment when I saw you? And Yves said that he had just come by the apartment to see if Francoise was home, but he got there and saw police inside and he knew something was wrong. But he specified that he hadn't seen or heard from her in about 5 days and didn't know she was missing, the last time he spoke to her was the morning of December 12th. Now, the instant Yves said December 12th, Barbier thought of two things. One is that was actually the day before the body was found in the parking lot. And two, based on the autopsy report, it was presumed that the victim was killed the day before her body was found, so December 12th. And so it's pretty suspicious that this guy is mentioning December 12th as the last time he saw Francoise. And so Barbier leaned in and he asked Yves to elaborate about the last time he saw Francoise on the 12th. And Yves said he had seen Francoise at her own apartment when he left the apartment around 8 a.m. on the 12th, and the two of them had made plans to meet up again at her place that evening. But he said when he got there that night, she wasn't home. But this was not unusual for her. So Yves explained that he just let himself inside her apartment with the spare key she had given him, and he just made himself dinner and he watched TV while he waited for her to eventually show up. And then he said at around 8 p.m., her landline, her home landline phone began to ring. Yves said that he answered the phone, which was not totally unusual, and he said the person who was calling claimed to be one of Francoise's friends. Yves said he didn't recognize the voice, but he said Francoise had a big circle of friends and he for sure did not know all of them. But Yves told Barbier that this caller was not calling the apartment to try to reach Francoise. They were calling the apartment to reach him, Yves, to tell him that apparently Francoise had decided to go out of town this weekend with some other friends and that she would not be home tonight. And Yves said this was not the first time that Francoise had ditched him. And so in his frustration after being told this by this friend, he said he grabbed his dinner plate and just chucked it on the floor and shattered it, and then he left. Barbier was surprised to hear this, and he was thinking if Yves was the type of person who would immediately start breaking things over something that, didn't seem like that big of a deal, well, what else was he capable of? However, as potentially suspicious as Yves was, Barbier had not actually confirmed whether Francoise was even his victim. This could just be a coincidence here, that she left town right before this body was found. She could be just fine. And so before Barbier let Yves go, because he couldn't really hold him at this point, he asked Yves to just give him a detailed account of what else he had done on December 12th. He wanted to get the full timeline of what he did on that day. And Yves just said after he had left Francoise's apartment that morning, when he and Francoise had made plans to meet up that night, he said he had spent most of the day at work, and then he had gone back to Francoise's apartment after work, and then after he had waited around for a while and got that phone call and broke the plate, he said he had just left and gone straight to his own apartment, which he shared with his mother, and he was there all night. And so Barbier wrote down what he said and made a note to follow up on his alibi. And then before he let Yves go, he just asked him if Francoise was planning to go anywhere or meet anybody on the day he last saw her. And Yves, he thought about it for a moment, and then he said, yeah, actually there was one thing Francoise had mentioned to him. She had told him that an acquaintance named Christian Moreau was supposed to come over her apartment later that morning to put up some new wallpaper in her apartment. The next morning, December 18th, Inspector Barbier knocked on the door of Christian's apartment, the guy who was going to put up the wallpaper. Now, at this point, forensics still had not confirmed whether or not Francoise was the victim. but for the time being, Barbier was working under the assumption that she was. A few seconds later, a young man answered the door and confirmed he was Christian Moreau. And so Barbier asked him if he remembered going to Francois Gendron's apartment on December 12th. And Christian said yes, he did remember, but he seemed confused about why he was being asked about it by a police officer. Barbier explained that Francoise was presumed to be missing and had even been possibly killed on the same day that Christian was at her apartment. And Christian looked very surprised to hear this. And he just said, I was there on the 12th. I got there around 10 a.m. that morning. Francoise seemed perfectly fine. She appeared to have just gotten out of the bath, and it just didn't seem like anything was wrong. However, Christian said he was only in the apartment around Francoise for like a minute because he just dropped off the new wallpaper and was going to install it on another day. So it was a very brief interaction, but again, she seemed fine during this very brief interaction. Barbier obviously had seen those rolls of new wallpaper just sitting in Francoise's apartment, so he figured this part of Christian's story had to be true, that he must have dropped them off. But it did seem a bit odd to drop the wallpaper off on one day and then come back at another time to actually perform the work. Like you could easily just do those two things at the same time. So he wondered whether this had actually been the plan all along, or if something unexpected had happened inside of the apartment with Francoise that had somehow stopped Christian from installing the wallpaper on that first visit. So Barbier asked Christian for his alibi for the rest of the day that Francoise had last been seen, which was the 12th. And Christian went over his entire day, he provided all the information, and then afterwards, Barbier, after taking down some notes, he said he would be in touch. Now at this moment, Barbier didn't have enough evidence to hold Christian for more questioning. But as he walked back to his car, Barbier hoped that forensics might find some fingerprints or blood in Francoise's apartment that could implicate Christian. A day later, Barbier sat down at his desk and read over a forensics report on Francoise's apartment. Now, there hadn't been any blood traces found, but a set of fingerprints had been pulled from the phone, and they matched the hands that had been found inside the blue trash bag. So this confirmed that Francoise was indeed the victim. But so far, there was no evidence pointing to who killed her. Yves, Francoise's boyfriend, his alibi checked out. And that handyman, Christian Moreau, he also had a solid alibi. And then as for Francoise's 19-year-old son who was serving in the military, well, he was confirmed to have been at his barracks over 200 miles away at the time of the murder, and so he was ruled out as a suspect. And then also he would say that he had not heard from his mother since several days before she was actually killed. Barbier was still trying to figure out who was that person who called Francoise's apartment when Yves was there, to tell Yves that, hey, your girlfriend's going to be out of town this weekend, because it just seemed like that was pretty suspicious, and this person who was calling must know something about Francoise's death. But this was the 1980s, so it was harder to get a hold of phone logs than it is today. Now, Barbier had submitted an order for those phone logs, but the order had to be signed by a judge still, and then it could also take several more days beyond that to actually get the records, and so there was a bit of a wait. However, just then, another officer knocked on Barbier's door and said that a phone call had just come in from someone claiming to have information about Francois Gendron. And so Barbier, he picks up the phone and he hears a woman's voice, and this woman tells him that she has information on Francoise. And Barbier immediately wondered, like, is this the same anonymous woman who called in before with that tip that Francoise was the victim? But Barbier just couldn't quite tell if it was the same voice. And so this woman told Barbier that she had been a very close friend of Francoise's, and she knew about two men named Michel and Luc who might have been involved in Francoise's death. She said right before she died, Francoise had found out that these two men were secretly involved in drug trafficking, and apparently they had talked about killing Francoise if she reported them to the police. Specifically, the caller said these two men had threatened Francoise that they would drug her, bleed her out, chop her into pieces, and then cut off her head so she could never be identified. Early the next morning, so on December 20th, 1988, 7 days after Francoise's body was found, Chief Inspector Barbier pulled up outside of a discount store in a shopping area in Tours. In front of the store, there were two men unloading boxes from a semi-truck. Barbier, he got out of his car and he began walking towards them. And when these two men saw the detective approaching, they immediately seemed sort of panicked. And when Barbier got close enough, He asked them if they were the store's owners, Michel and Luc, and one of the men nodded. At which point Barbier said, "You two are coming with me." About an hour later, Barbier walked down the hallway at the police station, past the doors of the interrogation rooms where Michel and Luc were currently being held. But first, he wanted to speak to the third person the police had brought in for questioning that morning, Sylvie Reverigo, who happened to be Francoise's best friend and friends with Michel and Luc. And he sat down across from her and he basically said, "Look, we know you're connected to the two men, Michel and Luc, and also to Francoise, and we want to know if you know anything about these two guys, because apparently they could have been threatening Francoise. We think they could be involved. Tell me everything you know." And Sylvie would tell Barbier that she was actually scared of Michel and Luc, and that was why she had not come to police yet, because she was worried if she told them what she knew, they would hurt her. She told Barbier that those two men had told her, Sylvie, that they intended to kill Francoise because they were worried that Francoise was going to report them to police for drug trafficking and selling stolen cars. And Sylvie said she didn't know if they were actually capable of that, but she just was too worried about going to the police about it and feared they would find out and then she would become a target as well. And so he and Sylvie chatted for a bit longer, and he got some additional information about when exactly they spoke to her and said this, and some other details about sort of their demeanor and the people they hung out with. And then after that, Barbier got up, he left the interrogation room, and in the hallway, he caught up with the detective who had actually already begun interrogating Luc. And the detective said that so far, Luc had totally refused to cooperate, and he'd outright denied even knowing who Sylvie was. Barbier sighed when he heard this, and he had a feeling right away that Michel was not going to be any more cooperative. But he was going to try his best to crack him. So Barbier went into the room where Michel was being held, and after he sat down, he just asked Michel if he had seen the news about that woman who was found chopped up in trash bags in a hospital parking lot. And Michel said yes, he had heard about that. And then he made a joke that maybe a surgeon at the hospital had made a pretty bad mistake or something. Barbier didn't react to the joke, and instead he just pulled out a folder and slid it across the table. And then Michel, he opened it up, and what he saw were photos of those blue trash bags and also photos of the severed body parts that had been found inside of them. And when Michel saw these pictures, he went completely pale. Barbier then asked Michel, "Do you know who that body belonged to?" And Michel, he just looked up and shook his head and said no. Barbier just stared at Michel for a moment, sort of just gauging his reaction. And then eventually he said, "Well, the body belonged to Francoise Gendron." When Michel heard this, he really looked like he was in complete shock. But Barbier immediately followed up and said, "Michel, did you kill Francoise?" And Michel, his reaction was to immediately shout no, that Francoise was a great friend of his and he would never hurt her. Barbier was crazy for thinking he would do that. And then again and again, he just insisted that he was completely innocent here. Now, immediately, Barbier thought Michel's reaction here was pretty genuine. But just then, there was a knock on the door, and so Barbier, he got up and he stepped out into the hallway, and another officer told him that the forensics team had just found a piece of evidence that almost certainly would crack this case wide open. Based on forensic evidence and an eventual confession, this is what police believe happened to Francoise Gendron on the morning of December 12, 1988. Around 10 a.m., the killer knocked on the door of Francoise's apartment. Francoise answered the door wrapped in a towel and told the killer to come on inside. The killer stepped in and they acted very friendly and casual, as if this visit was nothing out of the ordinary. But after the two had chatted for a while, the killer decided it was time to put their plan into action. After all, Francoise was a problem for them, and they had to deal with her once and for all. So, at some point, the killer told Francoise that they had something they wanted to show her, and asked if she would come over to the killer's home just for a minute to show them. Francoise eventually agreed, and once she got dressed, the two of them headed out together. And so the two of them, they walk their way to the killer's home, they go inside, and then before the killer is going to show Francoise, what they brought them over here to show them, they first made them both a pot of tea. And critically, the killer crushed up a few anti-anxiety pills and put those in the bottom of Francoise's cup of tea. Then the killer brought the tea over to the kitchen table where Francoise was sitting, and the killer sat down with her, and they both drank their tea. The killer made sure Francoise drank her entire cup, but by the time Francoise had finished her tea, she was so sedated from the drugs that she could barely sit up. At this point, the killer knew they could move on to the next phase of their plan. And so the killer at this point lifted Francoise up out of the seat. She didn't put up a fight, and they carried her over to the bathroom, and they put her into the tub, and they turned on the water. And then eventually, when the water filled up high enough, the killer just pushed Francoise's head under the water, and again, Francoise, because of the drugs, couldn't do anything to stop it. And she remained under the water until she fell unconscious. After Francoise was dead, the killer simply drained the tub and then cut Francoise's body into pieces to make it easier to dispose of. They took the pieces and shoved them into blue trash bags and then dumped them in the parking lot of a nearby hospital 10 minutes away. But the bigger problem for the killer was Francoise's head. The killer wanted to completely erase Francoise's identity. So, for that reason, they kept her head at their home. They would flush Francoise's teeth down the toilet, and they would take the other pieces of her head and they would throw them into a nearby river. However, despite all this effort, the killer forgot one thing, which was they put Francoise's hands in those blue trash bags, and so her body was identified by her fingerprints just a few days later. And then not long after that, a tip soon led the police right to the killer's door, and when they investigated the killer's home, they found crucial pieces of evidence in her bathroom. The killer was Francoise's own best friend, Sylvie Reverigo. Sylvie had always been sort of jealous of Francoise, primarily because she seemed happy all the time. And on top of that, Francoise got a lot of attention from men, which just, again, made Sylvie jealous. And since the two women, post-divorce, were spending so much time together, even more than in their childhood, their friendship had gotten suffocatingly close. And over this recent period of time where they were sort of on top of each other, Sylvie's jealousy and sort of resentment towards Francoise turned into full-blown hatred. Initially, Sylvie had tried to pin the murder on Michel and Luc by telling another friend of Francoise's, a woman named Yvette, that those two men had threatened to kill Francoise. And just as Sylvie had hoped, Yvette had called the police and passed along what she had said. But unbeknownst to Sylvie, Yvette also shared another tip with the investigators, which was that a few days after the murder, Yvette's own daughter had happened to go to Sylvie's house, and her daughter had found 2 gold dental crowns in the toilet. And the daughter and Yvette both knew that Francoise had gold dental crowns. So, by the time Sylvie was brought in for questioning, Inspector Barbier was already pretty sure she must have had something to do with Francoise's death. And so police would search Sylvie's home, and they would find traces of blood, and they would also find some of Francoise's jewelry hidden inside of a box. And then when Sylvie was confronted with all this evidence and testimony during her interrogation, Sylvie broke down and confessed. Sylvie Reverigo was charged with Francoise's murder on December 21st, 1988. 3 years later, she was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. One night in late August of 1557, a Frenchman in his 30s named Martin Guerre was laying in a bed in a makeshift military hospital in St. Quentin, France, writhing around in pain. So a few weeks earlier, Martin had fought in this massive battle between the French and Spanish armies. And it had been this just horrible, bloody, violent battle. And during it, Martin had been wounded very severely. In fact, he had lost his leg. Now, this injury was obviously just devastating and very painful, but Martin also knew he was just lucky to be alive here. The doctors who had treated him at one point had seemed certain that he was going to die. So Martin and his doctors were all very surprised when he didn't die and he pulled through and survived. And Martin knew that a lot of his comrades who'd already left St. Quentin by this point and moved on with the army or gone back home, they very likely thought that he had died, given how bad it looked. But he was alive and in a lot of pain. And really more than that, he was just sort of devastated. I mean, he was incredibly lonely. All of his army mates had basically left the hospital or just moved on with their careers or they'd gone home. And he was still here, unable to leave the hospital. And he has this injury too. He hasn't really gotten used to life without the use of his leg. And so His whole world has come crashing down. He's sort of by himself. All he has is the few army doctors who periodically come over and check on him. But beyond those people, he was just isolated and sort of trapped with these awful thoughts in his head 24/7. And eventually, these spiraling thoughts became really like the worst thing he was dealing with. Like they surpassed the actual physical pain he was dealing with. It was just this incredible depression that had set in. So Martin, he had grown up in this small rural village in southern France called Artigas. And he had gotten married at a very young age to a woman named Bertrande, and they had loved each other very much, and they had a son together. However, Martin had sort of completely messed up his life when he stole some grain from his father and had to literally flee town. Stealing, especially from a family member at the time, was not only criminal, but really quite shameful. And Martin had been so afraid of what people would say and what they would think of him that he decided not to face them at all. And he just left Artigas, leaving behind Bertrande and his son and his whole life. Now, initially, after he had sort of run away, he had considered going back and just saying he was sorry and accepting whatever punishment he'd be given. But he was always too scared to do it, and so he just didn't. And then before long, he got caught up in this war, and then years had passed by. It's like he's basically just gone. He's been removed from Bertrande and his son's life. Like he's just out of their lives. He's left them, and now, he's had his leg blown off. And in his mind, in this depressed state he was in, now, he had never really stopped thinking about his former life. He missed his wife terribly, but he's thinking to himself, I'm not the person she married. I'm a different person. I'm a degraded, bad person. She wouldn't even want to be with me at this point. And then beyond Bertrande and his son, and how they would look at him, he also was thinking that he was this thief, this shameful person that the rest of the village would not welcome back. So in his mind, he really felt not just isolated in this hospital, with no army mates nearby, stuck because of this injury, but he's also thinking, I don't even have a place in the world. I have nothing. My life is ruined. And so as Martin lay in the hospital bed, having these horrible thoughts and feeling all this physical pain in his leg, just having this horrible time, he found his mind wandering to somebody else in his life that had been very important to him, his friend Arnaud. He just wished if there was one person that he could talk to right now, it would be him. So Arnaud was a fellow soldier, and before this really horrible battle where Martin lost his leg, the two had been great friends and they bonded because they had a lot in common. They were both from small towns in the south of France, and they even looked the same, they could pass as brothers. So they'd gotten really close and they talked about their lives and they shared a lot with one another. But like everyone else in the military that Martin had been friendly with or just worked with, Arnaud had, moved on. He was no longer here. He had gone somewhere else, wherever the army sent him. And so Arnaud was just yet another person in his life who he wished he could spend more time with, but knew he wouldn't. And so Martin's recovery would take a very long time. He was stuck in a hospital, basically bedridden with these horrible thoughts and this awful pain for weeks, and then months, and then years passed by, and Martin still was just a shell of himself. And so he actually was moved to hospice care. However, after getting to hospice, Martin actually didn't die. Typically hospice care is for people that are at the end of life and that no longer is it about trying to save them, it's about keeping them comfortable until they pass away. But for Martin, he didn't die. He actually got better. And one afternoon in early September of 1560, so now about 3 years or so after he had lost his leg, Martin sat on a bench outside of the hospice that he had been staying in since the war had ended. Now, where he was located was actually just, a few miles from his hometown, Artigas. But despite the now close proximity to, his former life, if you will, to Martin, it felt like, Artigas could have been a million miles away. It couldn't have felt further away for him. So after Martin sort of miraculously healed inside of hospice care and he was outfitted with a wooden prosthetic leg and was told that he could now leave and go about his life, well, it was good on the one hand. He got to go, back into reality, but he still had a lot of health problems as a result of his injuries. And, given this treacherous stretch of time where he had just been stuck in bed having these horrible thoughts, he had completely convinced himself that truly he was a shell of the man he used to be, and that nobody from his previous life would want him. Not his wife, not his son, not anybody. Like he was nothing now. And so even though Martin was like better at this point, in his mind, he sort of had resigned himself to simply wasting away and dying all alone. He just figured, even though the doctors say I'm better, that's the path I'm on, and I'm not going to change it. But now, as Martin sat outside on this bench, he heard a voice. And when he looked over at the road in front of the hospice where he heard this voice, he saw there was a man that he had never met before who was clearly walking towards him, like that was the person speaking to him. As the man approached Martin, he asked him, "Are you Martin Gare?" And when Martin slowly nodded, saying, "Yes, I am," this man's face lit up, and he explained that he'd been looking all over for him. He said he'd been sent here on behalf of Martin's family back in Artigas, and he wanted to bring Martin back to them. When Martin heard this, he couldn't believe it. I mean, he really was so convinced that he was just destined for a life of shame and agony until he died. And now to hear that his family wants him back, they're looking for him, like this was incredible. This was unbelievable. I mean, he really assumed he would never go home again. And now here was this guy saying, "Come with me, let's go home." However, before Martin could ask any follow-up questions, of which he had many, like about his family and what they asked about him, that kind of thing, the man told Martin that actually he had been sent here to get Martin and he was going to bring him home, but first, they needed to stop at the courthouse in a city called Toulouse. Martin looked at him like, "What do you mean?" And the man explained the reason behind it, and Martin simply couldn't believe what he was being told. A few days later, on the morning of September 12th, Martin climbed out of a wagon in front of the courthouse in Toulouse, a city about 40 miles away from Artigas. And Martin, he felt butterflies in his stomach as he, used his cane to climb the court steps to get up to the front doors. And then when he got up there, he took a deep breath, threw open the double doors, and stepped inside. And the instant he did, the first thing he saw is the entire courthouse was filled with people. And they all turned to look at him, and everyone's speaking with these hushed voices like, "Oh my goodness, I can't believe it." And that's when Martin realized he had just walked directly in to the middle of a trial. And so Martin, for a second, he just stood there staring back at all these people who were turned to look at him. And he realized that he recognized many of their faces. He saw some of his friends, he saw his uncle Pierre and some of his sisters. He saw his wife, Bertrand, as well as a boy sitting next to her, who must have been his son. And all of these people, they're looking at Martin with just looks of absolute shock on their faces. Like they were completely stunned to see him, and they're all looking at his wooden leg, and they're looking back at him. It was like they couldn't believe he had just walked in here. However, before Martin could really, fully appreciate the emotional moment he was having here, seeing his loved ones after over a decade, he first looked towards the front of the courthouse. And as soon as Martin saw what was up there, he knew that what that man had told him, who came up to him on the bench in front of the hospice, was true. And Martin had to bite his lip to keep from screaming. It would turn out Martin was wrong to believe that, his wife and the town of Artigas would never accept him back, that he was worthless and should never return. Because his wife Bertrand and the town of Artigas actually did welcome him back. Or so they thought. Because when Martin walked into that courthouse and looked towards the front of the room, what he saw was his long-lost buddy Arnaud from the war. And Arnaud was on trial. Arnaud did not just look like he could be Martin's brother. He looked exactly like Martin. And since Arnaud really had been very disliked in his own hometown for being a con artist, he wanted a fresh start in a new place after he left the army. So, years earlier, while Martin was lying in a makeshift army hospital so badly injured that doctors were telling him he was almost certainly going to die, while that was happening, his best bud, Arnaud, was using their likeness and his knowledge of Martin's life from all the times that Martin had confided in his friend to literally steal Martin's life. Arnaud had waltzed into Artigas and told everyone there that he was Martin Gare. And the entire town not only believed him, they celebrated his return. Arnaud was actually so convincing that even Bertrand had believed Arnaud was her husband, and she had gone on to have 2 additional children with him, believing this was Martin. However, one person, Martin's uncle, Pierre, he just didn't buy it. He thought this guy was a fake. He thought he was an imposter, and he took him to court for fraud. And that trial was why the man had tracked Martin down at the hospice and brought him to Toulouse to help prove to everyone there that, look, Arnaud's an imposter because here's the real Martin. And of course, it worked, because when Martin stepped into that courtroom and his own family laid eyes on him, the actual Martin Guerre, they realized right away that Arnaud truly was a fake. Arnaud was ultimately sentenced to death and hanged in front of Martin's house in Artigas while the entire village watched. As for Bertrand, Martin's wife, she was horrified to learn that she had not recognized her own husband and that she had had 2 kids with a stranger. She begged Martin to forgive her, but he never did. When you're refreshing your space, choosing a paint color can feel weirdly high stakes. Will that seafoam green that you loved online look more like split pea soup on your walls? Luckily, Sherwin-Williams takes the guesswork out of finding the perfect paint color. With 3 easy ways to sample, you can choose color with confidence, testing shades in your actual space before making the final call. Order color chips, peel and stick, or color-to-go paint samples at swsamples.com or visit your neighborhood Sherwin-Williams store to get started today. One morning in November of 1940, an 84-year-old prospector named Erwin Robertson hiked down a snowy ridge in the Alaskan wilderness. He was pushing this sled that was full of supplies and animal furs, and it was pretty hard. I mean, as he was pushing this thing along, he was working so hard that he was breathing really heavy, and even though it was really cold outside, he could feel himself sweating underneath his clothes, like he was going to be covered in sweat. Now, Erwin knew that what he was doing was, risky. I mean, after all, he certainly was not as young as he used to be, and you don't want to get hurt out here or, totally exhaust yourself out here. I mean, this is the wild. But Erwin was not about to slow down because he could just not wait to get home. So Erwin had come to this area about 40 years earlier as part of the big Alaskan gold rush. And so, like basically every other prospector, he spent every summer and every fall at a cabin up in the mountains, predominantly hunting and mining. But his real home, where he really considered where he lived, was in the pioneer town of Eagle, Alaska, where he lived during the winter and the spring. And that is where Erwin was headed this morning. He had just wrapped up a very successful fall season up in the mountains, and he'd actually intended on staying in the cabin up in the mountains a bit longer. But a few days ago, the temperature had suddenly dropped, and Erwin did not have the supplies to wait out a winter storm up in that cabin. So he had packed up his things, told the handful of other prospectors in the area where he was going, and then he set out for Eagle. Now, this was a 100-mile trek to get to his home in Eagle, and it was through some very rough terrain, and also he's in Alaska, so this is like a very rough area to be navigating. But Erwin had made the trip at least once a year for the past 4 decades, so he knew what he was doing. So, despite really exerting himself here pushing the sled, he kept up as hard of a pace as he could manage for the next couple of hours, and then finally, around midday, he allowed himself to slow down and just take a quick break. However, after stopping and reaching into his parka and pulling out his canteen to take a sip of water, as he's sipping the canteen, something catches his attention out of the corner of his eye. And even though all he saw was just like a flash of movement out in the trees, he knew immediately what it was. So during this trek so far, there was this pack of wolves that was following him. He knew they were following him. But again, this is a man who lived in the wilds of Alaska, and so he was not unaccustomed to running into packs of wolves. He knew they were quite dangerous, especially for a guy who's alone in the woods right now, but he wasn't that concerned. However, he's thinking, okay, they're right over there. I'm gonna take a very quick break. He, capped his canteen, put it back in his parka, and he's like, I'm gonna keep on moving here. A few hours later, Irwin was a good ways further down the ridge, but he was starting to get cold. In fact, ice had formed on his beard and on his eyelashes. So the temperature had dropped much faster than he had expected, and he was starting to get worried because he knew it was only going to get much worse after the sun went down. And remember, he's been exerting himself this whole time. He's been sweating under his clothes, so he's wet under his clothes. And now the temperature's dropping, so he's like getting really, really cold. And so he decided that it was in his best interest to actually just stop right now and build a fire and just make sure he was warm. And so Irwin, he continued pushing his sled, keeping his eyes peeled for a good spot to actually stop and make camp. But as he's moving along, he hears something that causes him to just stop. It wasn't the sound of wolves. It was the sound of trickling water. And much like the wolves, water was quite dangerous out in the wilds of Alaska. But in many ways, water, especially in a very cold environment like this, was like the most lethal to people. Because getting fully wet in these temperatures basically guaranteed you would freeze to death. So Irwin moved very cautiously forward because, again, all he can do is hear the trickling water. He doesn't know where it is, and he's thinking, I better be careful I don't accidentally step into a creek or something and get wet here. He's already wet from sweating underneath his clothes. He can't afford to get more wet, and so he's moving carefully and cautiously. And then he rounds a bend and he actually sees the source of the sound. It was a creek that had basically completely frozen over, with the exception of a little bit of water that was sort of leaking out and sort of spilling out over the ice itself. And over time, this water that was making the sound and leaking out, it was sort of freezing in layers on the surface of this creek. And so it was kind of like this moundy block of ice that was sitting on top of this creek, but you could clearly see water sort of trickling its way through it. And so when Irwin saw this, he realized that, as long as he was very careful to avoid stepping on the frozen creek itself, that this area would actually make a great spot to spend the night. He could refill his canteen from the little spout of water coming out of the creek. Plus, there were a bunch of dead trees nearby, which were perfect for firewood. And this was good news, because by this point, Irwin was so cold he was shivering. So he parked his sled and then began gathering up some firewood. But as he was going around doing this, he spotted a few of those wolves who had not stopped following him, not very far away from him. They were sort of lingering in the trees, clearly watching him. And for the first time, Irwin started to feel pretty anxious about these wolves. The fact that they were now even closer than the last time he saw them suggested that, one, they're still following him, but two, they're getting braver, they're getting closer. But Irwin's thinking, I can't just continue on here. As much as it makes sense to get away from the wolves, I'm beat physically and I'm soaked, my clothes are wet, I'm getting so cold, I'm gonna die of hypothermia if I'm not careful. I gotta start this fire, I have to make camp here, I just have to. About 20 minutes later, Irwin had gathered up all the wood that he would need, and he piled it all next to his sled, and then he got ready to start his fire. And in this kind of very cold environment, actually starting the fire, the process of igniting the fire, was a potentially very dangerous process. Because in order to light the match, to light the fire, Irwin would have to take off his mittens and expose his hands to the freezing cold. But Irwin had to do it, so he reached down and he bit one of his mittens and pulled it off with his teeth, and then with that hand he reached into his parka and he pulled out his fire kit, which contained these thin scraps of tinder that he would use as fire-starting material. Then he grabbed a match and he struck it to light it, but it didn't catch, the head of the match did not catch on fire. And so Irwin tried again, striking the match once more, but it didn't light. And again, he just kept trying over and over, and eventually he just snapped the match in half. Now, Irwin didn't panic because he knew that, in extreme cold, some matches light better than others, and some don't even light at all. And he had seen this happen before, so he wasn't panicking. Instead, he pulled off his other mitten to make sure he had max dexterity here, and he took out the other match and he held the thing he was striking it against, and he struck this second match, thinking this one will light. But it didn't, and he tried again and again, and he's starting to get a little panicked when finally he strikes the match, and this one does catch. But by this point, he's now had his naked hands exposed to the unbelievably cold temperatures for over a minute, and his hands were starting to seize up from the cold. They were shaking, in fact, so badly from the cold that even though he's got this light, His hand shook so much that by the time he transferred it to the tinder, the shaking caused it to extinguish. It was out. And at this point, Erwin did start to panic because his hands are in so much pain and they're so stiff from the cold that he was afraid that even if he put his mittens back on his hands, they wouldn't warm up fast enough for him to then remove his mitten and try this whole fire thing again. He really needed the fire in order to warm his hands, but obviously he needs his hands to make the fire. And so he's got a problem here. So Erwin, who was not one to give up easily, he just gritted his teeth and with his, failing hands, he just reached down and, fumbled and grabbed a third match, thinking, I gotta light this one. I gotta start this fire to warm my hands up, to warm my whole body up. I gotta do this. And so he's got this third match. He's barely able to hold it. And it took all his focus just not to drop it. But finally, he managed to scrape it against the side of this matchbook. And to his relief, it did catch. And so immediately, Erwin, very carefully, kind of sheltered this little flame. And he carried it over to the tinder. And he put the flame on the tinder. But nothing happened. Erwin waited for the bundle to catch fire, but it didn't. And then the flame, the match, just burned out. And for a long moment, Erwin just stared at this scene in front of him in confusion. He didn't understand because he knew that this time he had done it all right. He had lit the match, he put it on the tinder. He had done this so many times before, but it's just not working. But then he looked more closely at the tinder and his heart just sank because he knew that the situation he was in was truly catastrophic. Several days later, there were some people living in Eagle, Alaska, who noticed that Erwin was not in Eagle. He had not arrived. And it didn't make any sense because he had told people when he would be there, and there was no reason he would be late unless something happened. And so these folks were just concerned enough that they went to authorities. And by November 19th, which is almost exactly a week after Erwin had struggled to light that fire, the U.S. Marshal's Office was out in force looking for Erwin. And so on November 19th, a deputy from the U.S. Marshal's Office who was out in the wilderness, a part of this search, he and his team came through these trees and he saw this clearing up ahead and he noticed there was something in the middle of it. It was a sled that was surrounded by supplies and it was set up on the bank of a frozen creek. And so immediately the deputy thought, this could be Erwin's sled. He could be nearby. And so he and his men, they rush down to this sled and they look around and they see there's a rifle propped up against a tree and there's this stack of unused firewood and there's all this tinder and a bunch of matches that are strewn about on the ground that also don't appear to have been used. But beyond these supplies and these things they're seeing, there was nothing else. Erwin was not here. However, the longer the deputy stood there just looking around, the more he realized what actually must have happened to Erwin. Because after sort of doing an initial scan, he realized there was something else in this clearing that he hadn't noticed at first. Wolf tracks. The deputy told his men that, very likely Erwin has been killed and carried off by wolves here, so follow these tracks and see if we can recover Erwin's body. And so the search party set out to go look. However, pretty quickly, they realized that, as they're following these tracks, that something just seemed off here. It seemed obvious given that Erwin had not shown up yet. He's been found, his stuff's all here, he's not here, and there's these tracks here. It seemed obvious that he must have been killed by wolves, but they don't see any blood anywhere. Wouldn't he have been attacked by his stuff? And there'd be signs of an attack, and then he's been dragged off. There should be a trail of blood or something. Any indication that a struggle happened, but no, it was just tracks, nothing else. And so eventually, as the deputy and his men are just following these tracks sort of farther and farther away from the sled and what they had found near the creek, they stopped and they're like, hold on a minute, something doesn't add up here. Let's go back and take another look at the actual site where the sled was, because again, there's no evidence of an actual wolf attack. There's just evidence of wolves. And so they turn around and they follow the wolf tracks back to where the sled is, and they start looking around more closely for, maybe there is some sign of a wolf attack that they missed, and they're looking around, and they eventually spot what appeared to be Erwin's tracks. And they began following these, thinking that, maybe Erwin had become hypothermic and confused and wandered off into the woods, and either he died out there or had been attacked out there by wolves, but let's follow these. And this is bound to lead us to wherever Erwin went. But the footprints, they only led away from the sled like a few feet before doubling back and stopping right at the edge of this frozen creek. And so for a minute, the deputy's looking down, like trying to make sense of how these tracks just stop right here. Like, did they miss something? Like, where did Erwin go? But then the deputy just literally looked at the creek towards the center of this frozen creek, which to that point he hadn't really been focusing on. It was like all the things on the land. Now he's looking at the creek itself, and suddenly he knew what happened to Erwin. So a week earlier, on the night that Erwin is trying to start this fire, he's desperate, he's becoming hypothermic, the wolves are nearby. He finally strikes that third match. He gets it to light, but the tinder won't light because the tinder was wet. We can assume the reason it was wet is because he kept his fire kit inside of his parka, and he was working so hard with that sled, he was sweating so much that he sweat on the tinder and he soaked it. And so now he does not have a way to start a fire. He cannot make fire. Without fire, he is going to freeze to death. There's no two ways about it. He is a veteran of the Alaskan wilderness. He knows he's doomed. And worse than that is he knows the wolves are getting closer and closer. And so no longer was it about like, oh, what do I have to do to survive this thing? No, it became, how do I want to die? And as he listened to the wolves howl not too far away, he thought to himself, I certainly don't want to die by being eaten alive. And so he made a choice. A week later, the deputy from the U.S. Marshal's office was standing by the creek trying to figure out what happened to Erwin, and he looks out and he realizes there is a lump in the middle of the ice, right in the center of the creek, that he had not recognized at first as anything significant, but now he was looking more closely and he realized it was Erwin. In an effort to avoid being eaten by wolves, Erwin had at some point walked into the middle of the creek, laid down on his back right in that break in the creek where that little bit of water was trickling out, that he had filled up his canteen right there. And he had just laid there, and the water kept spilling out onto him and gradually froze in layers over his whole body, essentially freezing himself into this cocoon in the creek. And so eventually he had frozen to death inside of the creek, but the ice had kept the wolves away. On the night of October 1st, 1999, a 75-year-old man named Steve Beard sat on the patio of his mansion in Austin, Texas, sipping on a cocktail. And it was a great night. Warm evening, the leaves rustling in the trees all around his property, and behind his house there was this creek that was flowing along. And in the house, he could hear his wife Celeste washing the dishes. So Steve had met Celeste only about 6 years ago. It was actually shortly after his first wife, Elise, had died of cancer. And Steve had been with his first wife for 45 years, and they'd raised 3 kids together. And he'd just been totally lost after she had passed away. And really, after she had died, he had spent a lot of nights just sitting alone at the Austin Country Club, where actually Celeste had been working as a waitress. Celeste was only 30 years old at the time, which meant she was almost 40 years younger than Steve. But there had been an immediate spark between them, and they got married just over a year later. Now, some of Steve's friends and family had immediately assumed that, given this age gap, that Celeste was simply after Steve for his money. Steve, after all, had made a fortune as a business owner and a TV station executive, and he was worth about $10 million. But Steve knew that money could not possibly be the only thing Celeste saw in him. I mean, he knew that he took great care of Celeste, and also he took great care of her twin teenage daughters. I mean, he really helped give Celeste and her girls the stability that they desperately needed. However, despite that stability, one thing that Celeste had always struggled with for much of her life was depression. And in fact, earlier that year, it had gotten so bad that Celeste had actually tried to end her own life. And, she had failed, she'd lived, but as a result of that attempt, she'd spent a few weeks in a psychiatric hospital. Now, of course, that was a really traumatic and awful thing for the family, but from Steve's perspective, the upside of this was that Celeste was put on some new medication as a result of this hospital stay. She had made some good friends, actually, while she was at the hospital, and to Steve, it just seemed like, maybe now things were starting to maybe turn around for Celeste. And to Steve, the fact that Celeste appeared to be on the right path again was great timing, because recently, Steve had actually been dealing with health problems of his own. Twice in the past few months, Steve had passed out and actually had to be hospitalized himself. The doctors told him he had high blood pressure, sleep apnea, and he had some heart and kidney issues, but they actually couldn't quite figure out why he was fainting. They just knew he had, several symptoms going on. Now, Steve thought it was very likely stress-related, and he just needed to relax. So in fact, in 2 days from now, he was going to be taking Celeste on a 3-week vacation around Europe. After everything Celeste had been through that year, and also, Steve had been through as well with his own medical issues, he felt like they both could use some time away, just the two of them. But now, when Steve got up from his seat out on the patio of his home and he put the empty cocktail glass down on the table and he turned and he opened the glass door that led into the bedroom, he saw that even though he'd already packed his suitcase for this European trip, several days ago, Celeste's suitcase was still empty in the closet. And Steve couldn't help but feel like it seems like Celeste might be getting cold feet about this European vacation. Like she should have been packed already and she's clearly putting it off. So Steve left the bedroom and he went down the hallway and went into the kitchen where he found Celeste cleaning up. And when he got in there, as gently as he could, he told Celeste, hey, when you get a chance, you really ought to pack. And she told him, oh, don't worry about it. She'd just been busy all week. She'd get to it. Steve nodded, but wasn't really convinced that she actually intended to pack soon, but he said okay. And then he looked over at the clock, and even though it was barely 9 p.m., he felt exhausted. So he told Celeste he was going to go to bed, and she told him that she actually intended to stay up for a bit longer. One of her daughters was having a sleepover at the family's lake house that night, and she said that she might go over there and just check on them later. Celeste told Steve that when she returned from doing that, she would sleep in a different room to avoid waking him up. Steve thanked her and gave her a kiss goodnight, and then he turned and walked back down the hallway, back into the bedroom. He got ready for bed, climbed into bed, and then he put on his oxygen mask because he had sleep apnea, and then he pulled the covers up, and he drifted off to sleep. Hours later, around 3 a.m., Steve woke up, and immediately he felt this horrible pain in his stomach. And even though it was dark in his room, he looked down, he's got the mask still on his face, and he could tell there was something on his stomach. And he reached down instinctively and he grabbed at his stomach and he felt something wet on his hands. And so in a panic, he ripped off his mask and he kind of sat up to look down at his abdomen. But as he did, just the pain he felt intensified so much just by trying to sit up that he fell back down. And so he reached over and he clicked on the light and he looked down and there was blood all over his stomach, like all over the sheets everywhere. And so he begins screaming out for Celeste. And as he's screaming, like the pain is only getting worse and worse, and Celeste is not coming in the room. She's not even responding. And so as he's looking down, like completely panic-stricken, watching all this blood coming out of his gut, he has no idea how this is happening. He just reached over and grabbed the phone and he dialed 911. Just minutes later, a squad car from the Travis County Sheriff's Department pulled up outside of Steve's house with its lights flashing. Deputy Alan Howard climbed out of that car and he saw a fire captain and another pair of deputies on the front step pounding on the door. All Deputy Howard knew was that a man in this home had called in with some kind of medical emergency, but the dispatcher had not quite understood what was wrong with him. And so Howard just ran over to the front door, and there the other deputies told him that so far nobody was answering their knocks. Howard knew at this point, time is of the essence. They had to get in and make sure this person was okay, and so he didn't want to just sit out here and wait any longer. So he left the front porch and he went along the side of the house to see if there was maybe another door that was unlocked somewhere else. And so as Howard went around to the side of the property, the other deputies followed him, and then Howard, he eventually found this flight of stairs that went up to a patio attached to a bedroom. And so up Howard went, the deputies followed, they got up there, and they looked into the house and they saw a light was on. And then through the glass door, they could all see there was an elderly man laying in bed with a telephone receiver in one hand, and his other hand appeared to be just covered in blood. Howard walked up to the door and tried to open it, but it was locked. So he pulled out his heavy-duty flashlight and he broke the glass, reached in, unlocked it, and slid the door open. Then Howard ran into the bedroom, and when he got right next to the bed, he looked at this man who was still conscious, but he had a gaping hole in his stomach, like his intestines were literally spilling out. And that's why his other hand was so covered in blood. It was like he was trying to hold his intestines inside of himself. Howard asked the guy what happened, And the old man just said he had no idea. He'd just woken up and his guts were coming out. At this point, the fire captain came into the room, and while he knelt down with his first aid kit to try to bandage up this man's wounds, Howard began looking around the bedroom for any clue about what was going on here. And he noticed something that was round and yellow lying on the carpet. So he bent down to get a better look, and he saw that the round yellow thing was a shotgun shell. And so at this point, it seemed fairly obvious that this man has been shot in the stomach with a shotgun. But Howard's also realizing that whoever pulled the trigger might still be in the house. So at this point, Howard drew his own weapon, and he crept slowly out into the hallway. And as Howard began searching the rest of the house, he didn't find anybody, but what he did find is there were lots of other entry points into the home, lots of doors and windows, and eventually when he found his way into the living room, he saw there was another set of sliding glass doors, and he walked right up to it and he found they were unlocked. Howard also saw that a table lamp in this living room was overturned, suggesting that somebody might have knocked it over while coming in or out of the house. And so Howard continued searching the living room, and then he found his way into the dining room, and then the kitchen, and then he went down a hallway into another wing of the house, and there he opened another door to a bedroom, and he found there was a woman inside, sleeping in her bed, totally sound asleep. At this point, Howard lowered the weapon, and he flipped on a light, and the woman immediately startled awake. And she was about to ask, what's going on here? But Howard just stopped her, and he told her that he was with the sheriff's department, and they were here responding to a 911 call. And he told her that the man in the other room was very badly injured, and he had called 911. And so the woman, as she's processing what she's being told, she began sobbing hysterically, and then just begged Howard not to let her husband die. And then a second later, in the midst of all this chaos, this teenage girl comes running in the room and goes right to the woman, and she grabs her the way a child would grab their mother, and they're sort of holding each other, and Deputy Howard, he's looking for potentially a shooter in the house. But just from the looks of it, it appeared very much like this is a woman who's very shocked, very shaken up by this. The girl, the teenager as well, appears equally shocked. But just to be sure, Howard asked this woman to identify herself, and through tears, she would say that her name was Celeste Beard, and that very likely the victim here, the person you're talking about, the man, is her husband, Stephen Beard. And then she also said that the teenage girl was her daughter. And so now, Howard, feeling pretty confident that these are just victims, he told them to just stay put, that he was going to search the rest of the house and just make sure that the house was safe. And so Howard, he leaves the room, he can still hear them crying behind him, and he searches the rest of the house. Huge house, but he searches every room. And there's nobody there. And so it appeared that whoever had shot Steve was gone. Around 5:30 a.m. on October 2nd, 1999, so about 2.5 hours after Steve Beard called 911, Sergeant Paul Knight walked through the waiting room at a hospital in Austin, Texas. Knight was a criminal investigator for the Travis County Sheriff's Department, and he'd been called in to lead the investigation into this shooting. Knight stopped at the front desk and he spoke to a nurse who told him that Steve Beard was in critical condition, so questioning him would not be possible right now. Sergeant Knight nodded and gave the nurse his card and asked them to give him a call if Steve's condition ever stabilized. As Knight turned to leave, he quickly scanned the waiting room, and he saw in the corner there was a deputy speaking to a woman who appeared to be in her 30s, as well as a teenage girl. The deputy waved to Knight and called him over, and so Knight went over and he introduced himself. The woman told Knight that she was Steve's wife, Celeste, and the girl was her daughter, Christina. And Knight, he said hello to them, but he knew that he had to do something that was going to come off as pretty insensitive, but he really had to do it as soon as possible. So after just, exchanging some pleasantries, he sat down and pulled out a gunpowder residue test kit. And then he asked Celeste and Christina if he could swab their hands before they began really getting into any sort of conversation here. And Celeste looked really surprised and asked if she was a suspect. And Knight explained that really at this point, everybody was a suspect. And so swabbing them for gunpowder would be the quickest way to rule them both out. So Celeste, who was still very clearly shaken up, she just put both her hands out, and Knight ran a test strip across both of them. And then after that, Christina put her hands out and he tested her hands as well. And then he waited for the test strips to develop. And about a minute later, he confirmed that they were both negative, meaning neither of them had fired a gun recently. And so with this test out of the way, Knight's entire demeanor sort of softened, and he asked Celeste to just walk him through what had happened that night. She told him that her husband, Steve, had gone to bed around 9 or 9:30, and shortly after that, she had left their home and driven over to the family's lake house to check on her other daughter, Jennifer, and her friends who were having a sleepover there. She said the lake house was about a half an hour away, and so by the time she finally came back after checking on Jennifer and the other girls, she said it was about midnight. And, she walked in the house and it was quiet, there was nothing unusual, and she said she went straight to bed. And she said she actually chose to sleep in a different room than Steve because Steve had gone to bed earlier and she had told him she didn't want to wake him up if she came home late. And so she was doing him a courtesy by sleeping in this other room. Knight asked Celeste if she knew anybody who might be mad at her husband or who might want to hurt him for any reason, and she said no. But she did say that the previous afternoon, her husband had gone out and cashed a really big check. He was going to give some cash to her twin daughters, while she and Steve were going to be in Europe. He wanted to give the kids some spending money while they were away, and it was quite a bit of money. And so she said, maybe somebody at the bank saw him cashing that check, knew he had a bunch of money on him. Maybe they followed him home to rob him. And so Knight and Celeste spoke for a little bit longer. And then when Knight was done questioning her, Celeste got up and said she was going to go outside and smoke a cigarette. And as she left, Knight turned to her daughter, Christina, and asked her about what she'd seen and heard from the previous night. Christina said she had been asleep all night until around 3:30 in the morning when she had woken up to police lights flashing outside her window. And as she continued to tell her story of what happened, Knight noticed that she was being really careful about what she was saying. Not like she was trying to remember some concocted story, but rather it was like she was literally trying her best to actually remember. Like she was struggling to remember just what amounted to a pretty traumatic and very, chaotic night. But before Knight could ask any more follow-up questions, another girl, another teenager, who looked exactly like Christina, ran into the waiting room, and immediately Christina got up to go over and hug her. And when the two girls pulled away from each other, Knight noticed that both of these girls were sobbing, and they really were just like identical. Christina introduced this new girl as her twin sister, Jennifer. And then just a few seconds after that, two teenage boys came through the hospital door, and they hurried over to join the group. And as they all sat down, Christina explained that the two boys were her and Jennifer's boyfriends. After Christina briefly updated her sister Jennifer and the two boyfriends about the condition of her stepfather, Knight turned to Jennifer and just asked her to please walk him through where she had been, the previous night. And Jennifer would say, she had been at the family's lake house, she was there with her boyfriend and one other friend, she'd been there all night. And then when they had found out something had happened to Steve, they had all rushed here as soon as they could. And so Knight, he asked the girls if either of them knew anyone who might want to harm their stepfather. And as soon as he asked that, Knight noticed the two teenage girls, they shared this quick, knowing look between themselves. At this point, Christina turned back to Knight and said there was only one person she could think of who would do something like this, a woman named Tracy Tarleton. She explained that Tracy was a friend of her mother's, and they'd met earlier that year at a psychiatric hospital where they had both been patients. But Christina said there was just something off about their friendship. Tracy seemed like really unstable, and Christina got the feeling that she was actually in love with their mom. And as soon as she said this, all four of the teens just sort of nodded knowingly, like this was something they definitely had talked about internally. And then they all began to agree out loud that Tracy very likely was the one who did this. And then a minute later, a fifth teenager came running into the hospital and they joined the group, and Jennifer introduced her as another friend. Her name was Amy Cozart, and she had been the other friend sleeping over at the lake house that night. And Amy, who literally had just joined and heard, no context to this point about anything the other teenagers had said, when she was asked pretty much right away by Knight if she knew of anyone who might have wanted to hurt Steve, she didn't hesitate. She just said, "Oh, Tracy Tarleton." Later that afternoon, around 3 o'clock, Sergeant Knight knocked on the front door of Tracy Tarleton's very unassuming ranch-style house in a working-class part of Austin, Texas. While running a check on Tracy to confirm her address, he'd also discovered that she had a weapons permit for a 20-gauge shotgun, the same caliber as the casing that was found inside the crime scene. Tracy answered the door pretty much right away, as if she had been waiting for someone to come by. And Knight, after introducing himself, told her that Steve Beard had been shot. And when he said this, he didn't notice any shock on Tracy's face. Instead, Tracy actually looked scared. Knight asked Tracy if she had any idea who might have shot Steve. And she said no, but then she asked if she needed a lawyer. And Knight said, well, that's up to you. And then before she could really react to that, he asked her if he could come inside. And Tracy just sort of turned and let him into the living room. Knight walked in, he sat down, and he just continued talking to Tracy. And so he asked her about her relationship with Celeste. And she said that yes, they had met at a psychiatric hospital when they were both being treated earlier that year for suicide attempts. And then, sort of unannounced, she told the detective that at first, when she had met Celeste, her feelings towards Celeste had not been platonic. They had been romantic. She had been interested in Celeste as a partner. But she then quickly clarified and said that was in the past and that now they really were just friends. And so Knight took stock of this and didn't really ask too many follow-up questions on their relationship. And instead, he just said, okay, well, where were you the night before? And Tracy said she had been here at her house the whole time. She said that she had ordered pizza and she'd had a few beers and then had just gone to bed. Knight asked her if she owned a gun. And Tracy said yes, but she only used it for skeet shooting. Knight asked if he could see her gun. And so Tracy got up and she walked over and opened up a closet and she pulled out a shotgun in a zippered case. Knight asked her if he could take her gun down to the ballistics department, and Tracy definitely hesitated for a moment, but then she was like, sure. Later that same day, Sergeant Knight walked through the crime scene at the Beard Mansion, looking for any clues that the investigators might have missed during the initial search. Celeste's twin daughters, Christina and Jennifer, had actually come with him to help point out anything that could be out of place that he wouldn't necessarily notice. Inside of Steve's bedroom, Knight saw that some of the drawers and closets had been left open, as if they had been ransacked by a burglar. But something about the whole scene just didn't seem right. The drawers, they didn't appear to have been ripped open as if somebody was in a rush. They had been pulled out really carefully, and inside the drawer, things were basically pretty neat. And so tonight, this didn't really appear to be a burglary. He suspected that someone might have staged the crime scene to appear to be a burglary to throw off the investigation. However, just for good measure, he asked the twin girls to look through all of these open drawers and closets to see if you can identify anything that was missing. And so the girls began looking around, and eventually Christina said that she couldn't find Stephen's watch or his sapphire ring. Now, on the one hand, this might give credit to the idea that this really was a burglary gone wrong, that Steve was just sort of in the wrong place at the wrong time and got shot by the burglar. But tonight, this development that these two small items were gone actually only seemed to confirm the idea that this was not a burglary gone wrong, because this whole house was chock full of nice jewelry and antiques. There's so many other things in the house that could have been taken that were obvious that were not taken. And so Knight, he left the bedroom, walked down the hallway, and went into the living room. And there he's looking around at all this obviously very expensive furniture and vases and paintings and all this stuff that's super valuable all over the place. He began to consider another possibility, that maybe somebody in the family had killed Steve for the inheritance. I mean, this guy clearly is loaded. Now, Knight didn't know what Steve's will said yet, but he knew that along with his two stepdaughters, he had 3 adult children from his first marriage, and all of them very likely stood to inherit millions of dollars when he died. And then there was Steve's wife, Celeste, who was less than half his age. It was hard not to wonder if she'd simply married him for his money. And so it wasn't really a far cry to wonder if maybe she had been involved in the shooting, because if he dies, maybe she'd get all of his money. And so as Knight was thinking about this and wandering back down the hallway, he noticed a trap door in the ceiling that led to an attic that he hadn't noticed before. So, curious, he reached up and pulled open the door, and then he climbed up the ladder that came down, and before long he was in the attic. And up in the attic, he saw there was a box lying on the floor just a few feet away, and, where everything else in the attic had been totally covered in dust and cobwebs, this box was not. It was perfectly clean, as if it had only been put up here pretty recently. So he grabbed the box and he opened the lid up, and inside was a 20-gauge shotgun. Knight knew this could be extremely important to this case, so he immediately packaged up the box, picked it up, and he carried it down the ladder back down to the main floor. And when he got down there, he saw one of the twin girls, Jennifer, staring at him looking really nervous. She rushed to explain that that shotgun she had purchased as an anniversary gift for her boyfriend, and she was just keeping it up there out of sight until it was time to give it to him. She swore the gun had never been fired, and she had not even taken it out of the box yet. Now, Knight heard what she said, but he held on to the box because he still was going to bring it back to the ballistics department right away to have it tested. I mean, it seemed very odd to him that Jennifer hadn't mentioned until now that there was a gun in the house and that it just happened to be the exact same gun, same caliber as the weapon that was used to shoot Steve. Now, Jennifer did have an alibi. She had been at the lake house at that sleepover 30 miles away on the night of Steve's shooting. But her sister, Christina, had been home the whole night, and Knight had to wonder if maybe the two sisters had plotted together to kill their stepfather, maybe for his money. After all, it just seemed weirdly convenient that Jennifer, Christina, their boyfriends, their other friend Amy had all, without any hesitation, named Tracy Tarleton as the suspect. It just seemed like something here was not quite adding up. That evening, Detective Knight went back to the hospital, and the nurse at the front desk told him that Steve was out of surgery and was stable enough to finally have visitors. She gave him Steve's room number and then let him through. However, when he got down the hallway to Steve's room, he saw this handwritten sign taped to the door that said no law enforcement personnel allowed to interview patient except in the presence of his attorney. And as Knight was processing this pretty surprising sign, out of nowhere, Steve's wife, Celeste, came rushing down the hallway and literally blocked him from going into the room. She said that for one, she was not going to allow any further searches of her and Steve's house, and if police wanted to speak to her husband, they'd have to go through the family's lawyer. And Knight, he was stunned by this, because in all his years on the force, he had never seen a victim hire a defense attorney. And then more than that, Knight wasn't even sure if Steve was the one who made this decision. Steve was stable now, but he really had no idea if he was actually conscious. Was it Steve who decided to put up this roadblock? Or was it Celeste? So at this point, Knight really didn't know what he was legally allowed to do here. And so, using an abundance of caution, he just turned around and left, at least for now. And as he, walked out of the hospital, he tried to make sense of why Celeste was suddenly being so defensive. Even if she was not the one who made this decision, the way she had just treated him in the hallway was just very aggressive. And then he began to wonder if maybe she had heard about the gun that he had found in their attic and was now trying to just protect her daughters. Or maybe she was trying to protect herself. On the afternoon of October 7th, so 5 days after Steve Beard was shot, Sergeant Paul Knight looked through a folder of interview notes at his desk. By this point, he'd spoken to all three of Steve's own children, his adult children, but they were all ruled out as suspects because they all lived hours away and had solid alibis. When Knight had asked one of Steve's sons if he knew who might have done this, he had told the detective to look into Celeste. After all, pretty much they all thought she was in this marriage for money to begin with. But, Knight had tested Celeste for gunshot residue right after the shooting, so he knew she literally could not have been the one who pulled the trigger. And so at this point, to Knight, it just sort of felt like the entire family was just pointing fingers at each other. But at the same time, Knight did feel like at least one family member on some side of the family was likely involved in the shooting. There was just frankly too much money at stake here. In particular, it was definitely suspicious that Celeste's daughter, Jennifer, had a 20-gauge shotgun in the attic. And on top of that, that she and her twin sister Christina and all of their friends had immediately pointed the finger at Tracy Tarleton. And then as for Tracy, she did have a pretty weak alibi and she did own a 20-gauge shotgun. But despite that, she had absolutely no history of doing anything violent like this. And she was remarkably cooperative and had even handed over her shotgun for analysis without really any fight at all. And so at this point, Knight knew he really just needed to speak directly to Steve. But the family's attorney was preventing the police from seeing him. And Knight wasn't sure how stable his condition was, or really how much longer he would even be alive for. So this was a very tenuous situation. But just then, Knight noticed something out of the corner of his eye. And he looked up, and he saw there was another detective in the doorway of his office, just sort of leaning there with a big smile on their face. Knight asked them what was going on, and the detective walked over and handed him a manila folder. And he told him this was a forensics report they had just gotten back. A piece of evidence that had been found at the crime scene may have just cracked the entire case.
「
Based on forensic evidence, confessions, and witness interviews, this is what police believe happened to Steve Beard in the early morning hours of October 2nd, 1999. Around 2:30 a.m., the killer turned off their headlights as they drove toward the Beard mansion. They parked at the back entrance to the property, far away from the house, so the noise of their engine wouldn't wake anybody up inside. They got out of the car, slung a shotgun over their shoulder, and began walking through the trees towards the mansion. And as the patio came into view, they stopped. They felt sick, and they actually didn't want to go through with this, but they had made a promise. They had to do it. So they swallowed their fear and continued walking towards the mansion. And when they got right to the steps that would lead up to the patio, they went to the right and they walked to a separate door that led into the living room. That glass door was unlocked, so they opened it up, they stepped inside, and then once inside, they navigated their way to the main bedroom. And when they went inside the main bedroom, they found Steve asleep in his bed. The killer walked to the foot of the bed and just stared at Steve for a second. And then, when they were ready, they raised the shotgun in their shaking hands, and they pulled the trigger. And the blast was deafening. Blood began pouring out of Steve's abdomen immediately. The killer reflexively racked the shotgun, ejecting the shotgun shell, getting ready to fire a second time if need be. But then, Steve, he began fumbling for the nightstand, like he was maybe reaching for a weapon of his own. And the killer, at this point, they're reaching down on the ground, trying to find the spent shotgun shell to take that with them. But they're so scared that Steve's about to shoot them. And so they just abandon the shotgun shell. And then with their shotgun, the killer runs out of the bedroom, down the hallway, back out through the living room, back out the same door they came in, knocking that lamp over in the process. They shut the doors behind them and ran to their car. And from there, they drove to a safe location where they washed their hands, they threw their clothes into the washer, and then they very thoroughly cleaned their shotgun. And then after it was pristine again, they put the shotgun back into storage. The killer was in fact Tracy Tarleton, Celeste's friend from the hospital who all the kids had said she's the one who did this. Well, it was her. The shell that was found on Steve's floor came back from ballistics as an exact match for Tracy's shotgun. And so she was arrested on October 8th, less than a week after the shooting. And then after she was arrested, she confessed to the killing and said that ultimately she had killed Steve because she was in love with Celeste and she wanted Celeste all to herself. However, a few months later, in January of 2000, Steve actually died from his injuries. And after that, a new story began to emerge. It turned out that Tracy's love for Celeste was not one-sided. The two women had been having a full-blown affair for months before the murder. In fact, Celeste had begun secretly slipping Everclear into Steve's cocktails, which is more than twice as strong as the vodka that Steve thought he was drinking. And so basically, Celeste would get Steve really, really drunk and get him to pass out. And then once he would pass out, Celeste would go sneak off and spend the night with Tracy. According to Tracy, Celeste had asked her to kill Steve so they could be together. And so for the first few months after Tracy's arrest, Tracy kept her mouth shut about Celeste's involvement. But then 5 months after Steve died, Celeste got remarried to a man that she had just met. And that's when Tracy realized that Celeste was not really in love with her. She had been using her to get rid of Steve so she could inherit all his money. And so when this happened, Tracy was so hurt by what Celeste had done that she began telling the real truth with the authorities. And eventually, she agreed to testify against Celeste. And so based on Tracy's testimony, Celeste was arrested on March 28, 2002. She was eventually found guilty of Steve's murder and sentenced to life in prison. Tracy was also convicted of murder, but because of her cooperation, her sentence was reduced to just 20 years, and she was actually released on parole in 2011.